All Things Conceivable, a surrogacy podcast with Nazca Fontes.
Well, hello. It is an incredible moment today in the field of the fertility world, and actually a massive victory for reproductive rights and families in the great state of Michigan. Surrogacy is now legal in Michigan. Last year, Michigan passed the Family Protection Act, which legalizes compensated surrogacy. And now the new law is in effect as of April 2nd, 2025. This landmark law decriminalizes surrogacy, offering new hope for families and empowering women to become surrogates to help families. The new Michigan law officially ends the state's long-standing ban on paid surrogacy agreements. Michigan has been a national outlier, enforcing a prohibition that has been in place since 1988 that not only made surrogacy illegal, but made it criminal. As a result, many parents were forced to seek help outside of their state and even undergo adoption procedures to gain legal rights to their own biological children. Now, through the work of Governor Whitmer, the Michigan Fertility Alliance, and so many more, Michigan's new law is one of the most comprehensive in the nation. And today, I'm so excited because we are joined by family lawyer Alexis Sorrell. She is a Michigan licensed attorney specializing in fertility law, and she's here to help us break down what this new law means for Michigan, Michiganders, and its impact on both intended parents and surrogates alike. Alexis, welcome. What an incredible time for Michigan.
Thank you so much. I am so excited. I am posting about it like crazy, so everybody who follows me is sick of seeing it. But you know what? It's worth the celebration.
It absolutely is. I mean, me too, right? On all of our social media channels and the blogospheres that folks like us follow, it's everywhere. And it's a huge victory because this law is uber comprehensive, right? I mean, it is such a great law. I think it rivals the best of surrogacy laws throughout this country. And, an expert like you is going to help us break it down a little bit. So just, in broad brush strokes right away, what does this law mean for surrogacy in Michigan?
So like you said at the beginning, I loved how you introduced it, that not only does it open up pathways to parenthood for intended parents in Michigan, but it also allows women in Michigan to make the choice for themselves to become surrogates, right? So it's granting them autonomy and protection at the same time, and it's opening up a whole new world and avenue to legal parentage for people who rely on surrogacy to start their family. In the first instance, it creates a statutory scheme that really acts as a roadmap for the steps that need to be followed in order to secure the legal arrangement between parents and surrogates, and then also how to get your parentage order, which will be the legal document that parents can get even before the child's born that says they are the parents, cuts off any presumed rights that may be lingering by virtue of the fact the surrogate has given birth. So I really like the fact, A, that there is this comprehensive statute, because not every state practice where surrogacy is practiced follows a statutory scheme. But I also like the way it is, like you said, it is comprehensive, but it's also not limiting. It doesn't say that in order to be parents, to pursue surrogacy in Michigan, you have to be married, you have to be heterosexual. It says none of those things. It's on the one hand very broad in its application, but on the other hand very specific on what you need to do to comply with it.
I mean, it's just a fabulous law. And, Conceivabilities is headquartered in the state of Illinois, and we were one of the first to enact protections for egg donation, for gestational surrogacy. But, some of those laws that we enacted a couple of decades ago are now somewhat antiquated. And so the breadth of the surrogacy laws now in Michigan are phenomenal. They, like you said, they offer so much protection and a lot of specifics on how to gain those protections through a surrogacy contract. So, let's talk a little bit. Let's lay the groundwork for our listeners and talk about the antiquated law that was in effect, that was, put into law back in, I believe it was 1988. Let's talk a little bit about what that looked like prior to today, April 2nd, 2025. If you were wanting to pursue surrogacy in Michigan, what were you facing?
So, like you said before, there were two very wrong things with the state of the law as it pertained to surrogacy before now. The first is that it stated that surrogacy agreements themselves, the contracts, were unenforceable. So what folks were doing was memorializing intentions if they were entering into surrogacy agreements under Michigan law, but they also had to be altruistic, compassionate, uncompensated. So if they were practicing surrogacy in the altruistic state, you had to know when signing the contract that really it was not worth anything, right? It would be unenforceable if you had to go to court and seek to enforce any of the provisions. It also meant that the surrogate would be the presumed parent. So there was no mechanism by which to affirmatively cut off any vestiges of parental rights or custody rights other than through adoption. And that was also an uphill battle because it was unenforceable. So in addition to that, the second, big hurdle was the fact that it could also be potentially treated as a crime. If there was compensation involved, you had this fear of anybody who would be somewhat directly or indirectly involved in the arrangement that they wouldn't want to touch it or go near it, of course, because, you could end up in jail or severely fined. So this also created, and I happen to live in New York. I'm licensed in New York and Michigan, and we had the same thing here until recently. This created a real fear and reluctance on the part of reproductive endocrinologists and mental health professionals and legal professionals to get involved. And so that had an even worse chilling effect of people trying to do it on their own. So it just really set people up for failure. And there was, of course, a case that made it in the media, Tammy Myers and her husband, who conceived through gestational surrogacy and had to undergo a many year legal battle to adopt her own children. And that helped actually, her visibility helped, I think with the Michigan Fertility Alliance together, bring this issue to the forefront of the legislature's concern in Michigan and really prompted a lot of the change.
What's so interesting is that, a lot of us working in this field and even those seeking to build families via surrogacy have this point of view that, there are favorable laws out there and that it's a patchwork, which is true, right? But they tend to think of more like if there's not a law on the books, then a law doesn't exist. But in states such as Michigan or New York, there were laws on the books and they were extremely unfavorable. And what people may not know is that a lot of these laws were put on the books in the late 80s as a result of that famous Baby M case, which,
right,
probably is so far in the distance that a lot of people don't recall it. But that's how these laws came to be enacted, right? As a response to the Baby M case.
Absolutely. So New Jersey, New York, Michigan, all followed suit after that, which, it was a traditional surrogacy case, should be specified, and it ended up with a custody dispute between the woman who was acting as the surrogate and egg donor in that case and the intended father, parents.
Right. And just to clarify for our listeners, traditional surrogacy, which is generally not practiced whatsoever and is extremely frowned upon, is when a surrogate uses her own genetic material, i.e. her eggs, in a surrogacy arrangement. So she is genetically related to the child that she's carrying. And that has all but been, abolished in the world of surrogacy. But that case, that famous case, really put into motion all of these laws that criminalize the act of surrogacy. So,
That's right.
New York, Michigan, now finally dissolving the bad laws, enacting more favorable ones. And so let's just talk a little bit too about not only the obvious in terms of getting rid of the criminality associated with this, but what other primary motivators were behind enacting the Michigan Family Protection Act?
Well, I'll tell you that, the same thing happened, I think, when the law changed in New York, is that everybody says, oh, the surrogacy law. And that is kind of like, the thing that's on the forefront and the splashiest newsworthy piece. But in both cases, in both New York and Michigan, they were really the legalization of surrogacy is one part of a very dynamic, multifaceted bill and law change that represents major progress in the state law with respect to all conception through assisted reproduction. So it applies to parentage in, donor arrangements as well, and also really catapults into the current reality of the world that we shouldn't be having paternity statutes anymore, right? We should have parentage statutes. And so there was also a sweeping effort with this law to change a lot of the language to be gender neutral. So I think it was just a demonstration that the status of legislation in Michigan is reflecting current social norms now. It is up to times. It is not an outlier, as you said, anymore. And this applies kind of across the board.
Indeed. The changing societal norms, certainly the advancements in reproductive technology, and, truly mobilized and galvanized legal advocacy has led to the push. And we're seeing it, gain momentum in some of the areas where there should have been broad protections all along. Again, New Jersey,
Absolutely.
New York,
Absolutely.
Michigan.
Yep. It's just a shift towards equality in every respect, which is celebrated and welcomed.
Indeed. And, when we think about the number of folks who have had to leave the comfort of their own state, their own backyard, to pursue family building elsewhere, and the challenges that alone has put on top of an already complex process, right? If you're already going through family building efforts, harnessing reproductive technology, needing to partner with an egg donor or a surrogate, and then adding the complexity of having to leave your own state to accomplish that, my goodness, right? We all know what's involved with this process.
Right.
So
I'm actually myself a parent through surrogacy, and as a Michigan resident, and this was many years ago, my kids are 8 and 11 now, it was not legal in New York, and I did have to do that exact process that you were just describing, essentially transfer care totally outside of our home state. And right, it's like taking a really invasive and sometimes heartbreaking process of infertility and exacerbating it by saying now you also have to find a new doctor in another state and move your embryos. So I get it.
Let's drill down on that just a little bit, because perhaps people listening to this really don't understand what intended parents maybe had to go through prior to the law changing. So let's just, give them an idea of what it meant to, like what it would have looked like if they stayed in their state and had all the protections and the advantage of working with trusted professionals versus, gosh, this is criminal where I live. I'm going to have to look elsewhere. Take us through that journey of what it would have looked like and what it looked like for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so when we're talking about choice of law and how the state law will be considered and impact our surrogacy arrangements, we think about points of contact with the state, right? So you're going to have, intended parents are going to have an agreement with their surrogate. That agreement has to be governed by a particular state law. There has to be a location where the intended parents create the embryos, where the embryos are stored, where the surrogate will come for embryo transfer, and then, of course, where you will go to court to get your parentage order, which then will result in the birth certificate in that state. So a lot of things are geographically dictated. When you have to go out of state, or if you didn't have to go out of state, I should say it in the affirmative, you would stay under the care of your own reproductive endocrinologist, where you did your IVF, where you created your embryos. Your embryos would stay there. The surrogate, wherever she lives, would come to your clinic. Your doctor would be, or your clinic, a partner of your doctor would be treating her. Your embryos would stay where they were, and she would come for embryo transfer here or there, wherever you are. And so there's continuity of care there. There's, not that panic that you feel when you know that your precious embryos are on a freight train or cargo truck somewhere going to another state. So that's a real plus, right? Because there's so much uncertainty already. In our case, nothing could touch New York, because if there was any points of contact, there was a risk that it could be argued that even if our surrogacy agreement was under another state law, the medicine took place in New York, and maybe that would be violative of our statute. So had to pack those embryos up, ship them out to New Jersey, and just who wants that? Who needs that? Also, for people who it matters to them, and a lot of people it does, it'd be nice to have your children have birth certificates in the state where they actually reside. So there's a lot of things that, while they're not earth-shattering at the end of the day, it's an additional sense of intrusiveness into something that's a very intimate part of your life.
Indeed. And I mean, boy, we could go down a rabbit hole with that topic, right?
Yeah,
but, as it relates to this form of family building and reproductive freedom, this is a watershed moment. It's just so beneficial in so many ways, and alleviates a large deal of unnecessary stress for intended parents. So let's talk a little bit, too, about the legal processes. I know we did at the beginning of the conversation, but walk our listeners through what the process is to establish and recognize intended parents as the legal parents.
Okay, so I always say to clients, you think about the legal process in two steps. The first is the surrogacy agreement, which is essentially just a really, really comprehensive contract between you and the surrogate and her spouse or partner if she has one. And that is where we look to the statute, the Michigan statute, as the roadmap, because the statute tells us everything we need to put into that contract. It tells us what the residency requirements are, what the eligibility requirements are. So, for example, age, you have to be over 21. Surrogate has to have given birth, had a live pregnancy before. So we go through all of the eligibility requirements. Then it tells us also what are the medical requirements, what has to happen, and we can recite that in the contract. We can say that the surrogate had a mental health evaluation. That's required. We can say that there was a physical health screening. We recite all of these things in the contract in lockstep with the statute. We talk about compensation. We talk about the surrogate's retaining autonomy to make health and welfare decisions for herself. All of this goes into the contract. Once that's signed, you have your embryo transfer, you're pregnant. Usually in practice, somewhere around the beginning of the second trimester, we go to court, and I say this figuratively, not literally, because in most cases now we can file electronically. And this is when we file a petition or a complaint with the local court that says, here, court, these parties all together, the surrogate and the parents, entered into this surrogacy agreement. It complies with the statute in all the ways that are enumerated. Issue an order pre-birth that says The intended parents are the legal parents. They assume all rights and responsibilities that come with that immediately upon birth. And on the flip side, that the surrogate and her spouse or partner have no rights or obligations vis-a-vis the child either. So that's in hand long before you even go to the hospital for delivery. Only once the baby's born, then we think about birth certificates, and that's more of an administrative process, because at that point, you're legally already, by virtue of the pre-birth order, the legal parents.
So, this really lays out the kind of the roadmap for intended parents, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation, very clearly. Like, they know step by step, and there's no worry that maybe you're going to be in the wrong county or in front of the wrong kind of judge, right? You are clear as long as all of the requirements of the statute are met.
That's right, and we can actually, under the new law, you can file for your parentage order. You could file where the child is going to reside, where the baby's born, or where you anticipate where the baby's born, where you as the intended parents live. So there's a real, there's options. There's definitely options. And another thing to note that's actually important, and I think also comforting, is that the statute also contemplates and anticipates, well, what if somebody has a surrogacy agreement that doesn't exactly comply with the statute? And it says then that in that case, the court will determine parentage consistent with the intent of the parties and what would be in the child's best interest. And, 9.5 times out of 10, even if the contract doesn't strictly comply with the statute, it's going to demonstrate intent. It's going to demonstrate that you as the parents are intending to be that and that the surrogate is not, in which case you've now given the court other grounds upon which to issue the order. Mm-hmm. So not to fear that everything has to be, flawless. Of course, you want it to be, but there are plans B and C in case something isn't.
Yes, as a layman might call, a little wiggle room in there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think what's important here is that while, certainly I never condone doing surrogacy independently. It is rife with complications and complexities where all kinds of things can go wrong, and folks really don't know how to navigate those choppy waters. But this helps to maybe bridge that gap for folks that do that. Or perhaps, when we all know those clients that say, oh, my brother-in-law, the tax attorney, can represent me in this endeavor, right? And, they're trying to draw up a contract that is not really compliant with the statute. You're saying that in Michigan, the way the law is now written, it allows the courts to really interpret that intent to ensure those children born as a result of these arrangements are really their best interests are being looked at and reviewed.
Yes, but that's only if the contract doesn't strictly comply. And if you work with an attorney, that this law requires Michigan licensed attorneys on both sides. So, there's protection on the surrogate's behalf, there's protection on the parent's behalf. And if that contract complies, the statute says the court must issue that parentage judgment in the first instance, which is huge because, why would you want to get bogged down having to prove that you really want to be the parent of your own child? Right. So it's a really clear-cut directive to the judges who will be receiving these cases.
And how about the women who become surrogates in Michigan? We've talked quite a bit about how this is offering a great deal of protections for intended parents and the parentage of their own children. But what does this law mean for women who want to become the surrogates?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's just wonderful that they're no longer being told what they can and can't do, with their bodies and their lives. But also, look, you and I know because we're in this world. But for those who don't, you never a surrogate doesn't come to this for financial gain only. The women who do this are just this, and they're enigmas. It's like, you can't even believe that human beings could be so selfless. But the women who want to do this, yes, it's wonderful to have the compensation that they deserve, and that's freely negotiated. But also that there's some other purpose that's drawing them to this, and it's to help, and it's to use a gift that they feel they've been given. So the ability to do that, and to also be recognized as somebody who can negotiate her own deal and assert her, musts and must not in the context of a freely negotiated contract is also really freeing and empowering. She will have her own attorney who advocates for her and her alone, which is not to say that there's, a lot of adversarial negotiations that go on with surrogacy contracts. They're not. Everybody's got a common goal, but certainly everybody has also individual interests that need to be protected. And so that will be the case too with her independent counsel.
I think that's such an important point, Alexis. When we talk about surrogacy, and a lot of the naysayers out there, they oftentimes fail to recognize that, she does write her own deal.
Yep.
She does have independent legal counsel. She does come to this after being thoroughly screened and is clear thinking about the process and in her motivation to do so. I always chuckle when I hear about this notion of altruistic surrogacy. Like that's some sort of, lofty moral high ground, that surrogates should be doing this only for altruistic reasons. Because you're right, they are enigmas. They truly want to do a good turn. Like for them, it's win-win. But when I think of, when I always pose the question, I say, "Oh, you mean you want her to do it for free? You want free labor from her?" It kind of stops people in their tracks, and they realize that their argument is hollow. That these women are negotiating their own position in the arrangement, and they do it quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll say that in my professional experience, I see that, but also in my personal experience, I deferred to this woman on almost everything. She knew what she was doing. They really they have the confidence when they're approaching this because they know they can do this physically. They know how to navigate the world of obstetrics and all of that. And it's pretty marvelous to watch, and just almost take a back seat to it and comfort, like, okay, you got this.
Indeed, yes, they are very smart, clear-thinking women, and you have this personal experience, and you were also instrumental in the recent passage of the Child Parent Security Act in New York, the one that the legislation that legalized gestational surrogacy in the state of New York. So, what lessons were learned from your experience in that, and from other states? In your participation in getting that legislation passed?
I'm actually very happy you asked that because I didn't know you were going to ask that, and it's good. But I have to tell you, the Child Parent Security Act in New York went into effect in 2021, and I say to people, I spent the first 2 years after that just demystifying and quelling people's fears. And I don't blame them. And it's probably going to be maybe a little bit like that at the beginning at Michigan too. If you're a physician in this space, if you're an agency working in this space, if you're parents, if you're surrogates, because even if you're a judge hearing a parentage case of this, because we're talking about something that was yesterday a crime. Literally yesterday, right? April 1st, it was a crime. April 2nd, you're just supposed to know what you're doing and embrace it and, go run with it. So I think that the biggest thing is education and demystification at the very beginning. Just make people comfortable with it, right? Understand that The only good thing about being last to the party is that you've had the benefit of seeing everybody else who came before you and what they did right and what they did wrong. And you can then kind of implement that when you're rolling it out. So I think education is the biggest piece that is critical at the very beginning. Physicians need to know how to respond to patients' questions about the new law, and they may or may not know the nuances, nor should they. So, freely reach out to attorneys, have attorneys provide maybe just, sometimes I just give like a bullet point even to some of the clinics, just so if your patient comes in and says, wait, do I have to live in this state in order to do it? Well, you're a doctor, you're not a lawyer, you shouldn't have to know that, but here's your handy dandy reference guide, right? Or, even things like insurance. And people are kind of learning and navigating how this process works so smoothly in other states, but at the very beginning it might not be so smooth. So, team up with people who have seen this, done this before, and educate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I absolutely saw that in New York. There was a lot of trepidation on how to proceed.
Yes.
And, I think that the best way that professionals can embark on, this new pathway forward is to really lean on professionals who have been doing it for a long time. Ask the questions, get comfortable, ask for help and advice.
Yes.
We've been there shoulder to shoulder with many of these professionals who are navigating these new waters. And, it's great on the one hand, but it can be overwhelming on the other if
Right.
you're not familiar with it. So I'm with you. In New York, we really had to sort of bring some clinics along with us and get them comfortable. Because like you said, one day it's illegal and the very next it's not. And,
Right.
You can't just flip a switch overnight.
Right. That's exactly right. But we're up and running here in New York, and we'll be up and running in Michigan in no time.
Yes, indeed. And so, this new law, it does set an important precedent for other states. And, those states are, thankfully dwindling in numbers. But, it sets an important precedent for these states, particularly those with the restrictive or unclear surrogacy regulations, right? I'm talking
Right.
about Nebraska, Louisiana, Wyoming's sort of out there in the wilderness a little bit. So what could this mean for legal reform in some of these more restrictive states?
Well, I think, again, it's the same thing, the same concept that the benefit of being one of the last is to learn from what was done right and wrong before. And, even before there was New York, and before there was Michigan, and before there was Washington and New Jersey and all the states that do have really good legislation now, we had things like the Uniform Parentage Act. And so it is, the more we build on it and perfect it, the better roadmap we have for other states to follow in lockstep with this reform. I think also it may be that if it's not practiced there long enough, right, and people avoid those states for reasons of fear, maybe it'll bring the local politics some awareness to say, why are we the only ones left? And just staying clear of the danger zones. And until we have more clarity in some of those states and we have certainty, that's just what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to steer clear.
Well, thankfully, like I mentioned, the numbers are dwindling, right? There's very few holdouts. I think that we probably have some states where we need to shore up the laws that are in place and take another look at them because they're becoming a little bit antiquated, but at least they're there, right? And so, still ground to travel, but tremendous strides have been made in the last decade. So we were all waiting for New York, and then we were all waiting for Michigan. And so it is a great, fantastic moment in the arc of our professional lives in reproductive medicine. So a lot to celebrate today on April 2nd.
Yes, I second that.
And so, before we wrap, Alexis, what is your maybe from 10,000 feet point of view on how this is really going to impact our field as a whole. Any final thoughts? Any interesting tidbits of experience you want to share for us?
Well, I think that it's interesting. A lot of people are saying like, oh, Michigan is the perfect state for surrogacy, because it's so vast, and there's such a range of socioeconomic communities, that really, like, there's a great mix of intended parents and surrogate candidates, and people could really use this law to say we can do everything at home in our home state. We don't have to. It's not required to be a Michigan match, but it's a big enough state that you could actually do that. I think people in New York at first thought there was going to be tons and tons of New York parents matching only with New York surrogates, and for some reason it didn't. We don't have as many surrogates, women, applying to be surrogates in New York as we thought we would. We're already seeing that that's different in Michigan. Women are coming out, by the tens of thousands who want to do this. And so I think it's going to be really great for keeping things close. It's going to be great for, like I said, continuity of care. People, parents who are working with a particular clinic and want to maintain that. Surrogates who really want to maintain their relationships with their OBs. Everybody, under one roof, it seems like a win-win situation. I think opening up, like you said, opening up to the rest of the world to show here's how you can do it late but do it right is cause for reform, maybe. Unfortunately, sometimes reform comes on the heels of a bad case, case, and in this case, it was the bravery of the Myers family, who came out after having, years of struggle to adopt their own children. But it demonstrates to everybody else what good can come on the other side of that. I also really love that it is accessible to so many people. Like I said, the residency requirement under the Michigan statute is not really a residency requirement at all. In order to benefit from the Michigan law, either the surrogate has to live there, the parents have to live there, or the medicine can take place there. So you could have parents who are living in a state where it's actually really unfavorable. You could have parents, same-sex parents, who live somewhere where, the statute doesn't allow for surrogacy enforcement so freely unless it's a married heterosexual couple. And this is lovely because now they can come, they can do their embryo creation in Michigan, and they can benefit from the protections of Michigan law that way. So it's expansive, and it really opens up more opportunities to build your family this way, not just to people in Michigan, but other intended parents too.
Well said, Alexis. And, I hope I am high-fiving you in the air today. This has been, a great chat with you, and to help celebrate a major watershed moment for our field today, as surrogacy has become legalized in the great state of Michigan. And all of the families over the course of time, thousands of them that will surely be born as a result of the protections that this new piece of legislation provides to good families who are being created every day. So thank you for helping me celebrate today,
for having me,
and for your expertise. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. We'll talk soon.
Well, my guest, Alexis Sorrell, today was just, a fount of information and wisdom about all things surrogacy in the state of Michigan. If you are an intended parent considering surrogacy to grow your family, or a woman in Michigan curious about becoming a surrogate, know that Conceivabilities is here to support you every step of the way. Surrogacy can be a life-changing journey, and we would be honored to help make it possible. Conceivabilities, of course, is now accepting applications from Michigan women interested in becoming surrogates. With our innovative all-in care and compensation package for surrogates, you'll receive top-tier pay expert legal and insurance guidance, and a dedicated team of surrogacy professionals who will be with you every step of the process. If you've ever thought about becoming a surrogate, now's the perfect time to learn more. Go to conceivabilities.com to learn more. Listen to other episodes of All Things Conceivable. And until next time, take great care.
At Conceivabilities, we believe that everyone who wants to become a parent can. Our agency has helped build thousands of families for nearly 25 years. Whether you are an intended parent ready to fulfill your family destiny, a surrogate answering your calling, or an egg donor wanting to expand what's possible in your life, we are your people. See how matching matters. Learn more by joining our Surrogacy Learning Center community at surrogacylearningcenter.conceivabilities.com.